Oh. Hello, Eleanor. Can you hear me okay? I can't hear myself, unfortunately, other than, normally I can hear myself from my mic, but if you can hear me, I'm assuming that the audience can. I'd like to start by saying welcome. Thank you. My name's Chaz, and I'm in South Korea. Been here for 8 years. I didn't honestly know that we were only an hour away time zone wise. No idea that we were that close. And as to the resolution, it's my puppy squirming away. Prisoners should have the option to enlist in the army instead of serve time. I want to clarify, while I believe that's true, I don't think it's true. It should be true in 100% of the cases. No serial killers, no rapists, or somebody who's, in the military who commits a violent crime and then tries to escape or continue in the military as a way out. So, exceptions. There'll be exceptions, obviously. But I spent 10 years in the military all over the world, and I served with people who had taken the go to jail or, go to prison or serve option. And some of them were assholes, but there was not a larger percentage of, fellow felon assholes than there were, choir boy assholes. And I can explain, give a little bit more detail when I talk again. Right now, this is just sort of an introduction. So I'm going to pass it over to you and let you introduce yourself. Here you go.
Thanks. Yeah, so I'm Ellie. I'm in Australia. Also surprised to learn that I'm only an hour time zone difference away. So just in terms of sort of a preliminary response to that introduction, because of course haven't heard the majority of your case yet. I guess the majority of my case is just going to be about, I think it's bad to have prisoners with probably quite limited rehab and things like that in the army. But I'll also look at kind of the consequences for the prisoners later in the debate. But just in terms of why I think this could be, quite problematic for the army is I think even people who, aren't killers or rapists or people who you obviously don't want in the kind of high pressure, high responsibility is, even those people are often in prison needing things like rehabilitation with very limited education, things like that. And I think that can often, wanting to escape prison by going into the army instead can, appear as a really attractive choice, but ultimately those people aren't particularly prepared for the army. That's because, their motivation is to get out of going to prison, not because of a, great patriotism or a good member of the army. But more than that, I think these are obviously people who, have problems because they've committed a crime and they've gone to prison. And I think that can be quite problematic in terms of making them perhaps more reckless and making their experience of training and the army less effective. And it's probably, ultimately, they're probably not the kind of people who would be the most effective kind of people to be in the army, because let's note that they're most likely going to be in particularly stressful situations or situations that require a lot of responsibility. I'm not necessarily convinced that they would have that kind of responsibility that they would need, but also just that I think that it would be true that a lot of the kind of people who would be going into the army would be serving in like an on-the-ground capacity. I don't think there'd be that many people going to jail and then deciding to go to the army who would have a background in logistics or in engineering or whatever it would be that wouldn't put them on the front line. And so I think what you're doing is you're putting people who are not particularly experienced and not necessarily the greatest decision makers on the front line in particularly high stress situations. I can't really see how that would be a safe or effective thing. Yeah, so that's a kind of brief introduction, and I'll pass the mic back to you.
Thank you kindly. I should tell you real quick that there's an awful lot of reverb that I'm hearing. I don't know whether you are hearing it at all, but it's very stuttery for me. I don't know whether it'll be that'll be true for, you know, the audiences later. Well, I'd like to talk first about the reasons primarily that people end up in prison or in a life of crime. And, you know, the two of the major reasons are drugs and poverty / unemployment. And, you know, you can't find a job and maybe you have a problem with drugs at the same time. So you do things that you wouldn't have otherwise. There's a lot of criminals out there, you know, who were decent people, who were good people, and make a few mistakes. And the way that our legal system works is they put you in jail, and it's sort of like a college for crime. You know, that's literally what prisons are. And see, in the military, you can't do drugs. I'm not saying that it never happens, but a really small percentage. And that's because since the 1970s, there's been random mandatory drug testing. It has the euphemism of golden flow. So you literally, when you show up to work one morning, they grab you and march you to a place to pee in a bottle with an observer. Literally somebody who's watching the urine flow out of your body into a container. You know, for men, it's men who are the observers. For women, it's women. But, you know, that's still how it's done. And that cuts down on an awful lot of the opportunity to abuse drugs. Plus, you have a job. And it's a misconception that the military doesn't pay well. But I'm going to address that in my next segment, because I only have 13 seconds left at this point. So over to you.
Sure, thanks. So I'll kind of respond to the ideas that you brought about prisoners, and the kind of what I think that means for prisoners, and the kind of people, I guess, who would be doing this. So I think you're right to say that sort of the majority of people who would be likely to be offered the scheme and to take it up would be people who were on like fairly petty crime offences, people who'd taken drugs, people who had, you know, had the kind of effects of poverty and unemployment that make you want to do like petty theft or whatever. I think that's probably true, and I think they're usually good people. What I do think is problematic here is that I guess you can say we have two sort of classes of criminals we're talking here. Probably the majority are these good people, and in their case, I think it's probably pretty unfair to kind of give them this option to go either you can, you know, languish in prison for overly long times for taking weed once, or you can go fight on the front line. And particularly when they're people with really limited education and limited options, that seems like a particularly unfair kind of choice to offer them. But more than that, I think that to frame this as though it's like the only way to fix drug problems and unemployment problems is probably not that realistic, in that, you know, we can get better drug law that's not as harsh, or we can you know, have social projects or whatever you want to talk about in terms of economic improvement. I think there's lots of like more socially based initiatives that can limit crime in probably more effective ways, that are like proactive rather than reactive. And I'd also just say that I think this would actually have quite a negative effect on laws generally, because if it becomes profitable or if it becomes effective to rely on a prison population to fuel the army, then I think that could be that could provide quite a lot of political capital in terms of having a really tough on crime approach and trying to get people, catch people as criminals and try and get them into the army. And I don't necessarily think that's a particularly fair thing to do for people. But then secondly, just in terms of the welfare of these criminals, I think the kind of good people that we're talking about here often have things like trauma. They often have problematic backgrounds that cause criminal behaviors later in life. Obviously that doesn't make them bad people, and that should mean that they have second chances in life. But what that requires is rehab, and that requires not exactly a really strict, regimented army environment, particularly one where they might be exposed to more trauma and particularly severe trauma. Rather, having better prison rehab programs is probably a better option for getting those people to integrate back into their own society. Yeah, so at the end of this segment, basically, I think that the kind of prisoners who we're mostly talking about thus far in the debate are generally pretty good, but probably don't deserve to be forced into the army, particularly when they're going to be most likely put on the front line, and also probably deserve better social programs and rehab and things like that, which would ultimately probably be more effective in the long term. Over to you.
Thank you kindly. Let me explain first that currently for enlistment and retention, or commissioning and retention, that about 70% of millennials, which is the target recruitment age, aren't actually don't meet the requirements for various reasons, even to be in the military. Retention is a problem, and the people who would be given the opportunity to enlist, you're not compelled to enlist, but or to go into the military. But imagine given the option of going into a prison where maybe there's going to be some programs for you in the prison, but from day one, from literally the first day that you're in the military currently right now, you're going to be bringing home about $1,400 a month, and they're going to be paying for your housing, and they're going to be paying for your food, and they're going to be paying for absolutely everything, for your medical. As an example, you'll have no medical bills, and medical includes visits with a psychologist or a psychiatrist if you need one. So I think that it would be helping, instead of producing better criminals, we'd be producing people that would be able to contribute to society, not only in the military but outside of it. Plus, there's lots of people, of course, who suffer serious trauma in the military, but not actually very many as a percentage. Most people who go into the military, and really regardless of the branch, don't live lives that are dramatically different than civilians. And that's from firsthand experience. And, I haven't been in the military in a long time, but I still have lots of friends who are. I'm on an army base here about a couple of hours away fairly frequently, but I see that I have to pass the mic.
All right, so just quickly, I think I'll just talk about, or just kind of expand on ideas about how this might affect prisons and law and the way prisoners in general are treated more broadly. So you mentioned two things. First off, you mentioned that 70% of millennials don't meet the requirements for the army. And second, you talked about how the army appears like a much better option than prison, because you get an income, you get your meals paid, so on. I think that that's actually pretty problematic. that's because, one, the military has a pretty strong incentive to try and get prisoners into it, because so many people don't meet the requirements. So they've got a demand for manpower or woman power or whatever it may be, and so in that case they want people in, and I think that and the ease of getting people in, because it looks like such a good opportunity, is something that could be quite problematic, just because it would do things like encourage like harsher and perhaps unjust laws in order to get more, like a higher prison population, and then by extension, a higher population going into the army. And the other thing I think it does is it disincentivizes prison reform. Because if we then say, for the people who need rehabilitation, the army is the option. For the people who need an escape from poverty, the army is the option there. If we then kind of put that burden on the army instead of prisons, I think that allows prisons to continue to be like quite ineffective and like problematic places, because we've got the army as this fallback option that stops us from needing things like reform, and so I think that's like a pretty significant problem. Then just in terms of trauma, I think that like, sure, it's like possibly true, I haven't checked it, but I think like even if it is true that the percentage of people with trauma in the army or the military or so forth is like relatively low, ultimately when you've got people going in there who already have trauma, who may have suffered like particularly problematic childhoods, or like have been involved in violent crime, which is like quite possibly traumatic, when you have people with existing trauma going into a situation that is like very high pressure, that can be something that like actually intensifies that trauma. And so even though the majority perhaps of the military don't experience that, these people are particularly likely to experience that. But beyond that, I just bring back the previous material I gave you, where these people are unlikely to be particularly educated. They're probably the most likely to be put on the front line rather than in logistics or engineering or so forth. And that means that they're, again, the most likely people to be exposed to trauma. And that's problematic in terms of their recovery, in terms of like breaking the cycle of criminality. And so I guess at the end of that point, I just thought the prisoners' welfare, or rather the newly enlisted military people, their welfare is probably compromised under the affirming side in this debate. I'll pass the mic now.
Again, I'm gonna have to give a little bit of anecdotal evidence here. I worked with people who were former felons. I was in for 10 years, and I served. I probably spent literal years with machine guns sitting in foxholes, if you add it up all the time. And for a lot of people, the military's family, they had a shitty family growing up. They had a shitty family life. And, when I was still in elementary school with no plans ever to join the military. In fact, I'm the only member of my family who's ever joined. But had a friend who was a shithead in middle school and high school, and he basically was just a shithead every waking moment. Sort of a fun guy to hang around, but still a shithead. Well, his family life was appalling. So he broke into Disneyland. I was living in Anaheim, California at the time, and he broke into their ticket office and stole like 11,000 tickets, this ridiculous number of tickets. And he'd been in lots of trouble before. And even though this was long before there was any 3 strikes and you're out policy, he was going to spend a sizable portion of his life in prison. It was becoming obvious. And they decided to use the tickets, a bunch of him and his buddies, on a day that was actually reserved for the military. That's what made it sort of funny. So he shows up on this special day for veterans using tickets that he shouldn't have, possessed, because apparently they didn't actually keep very good track of that sort of thing in the 70s. But he was nabbed, his buddies were nabbed, and it was go into the military or, go to prison. And he opted for the former and turned himself around. Seriously, the military wasn't family for me. I had pretty shitty family life, but lucky enough that I turned myself around. My family life was good, but I have personal testimony of the military turning people around as family.
All right. Okay. So I'll just kind of respond to the idea that military can form, a second family and sort of work to break cycles of criminality or break cycles of mental illness or trauma or whatever it is that drives criminality. I guess the first thing to say is, obviously that's a lovely anecdote, and I'm glad it worked out for your Disneyland ticket stealing friend. But it's not necessarily true for everyone who goes into the army, and it's problematic if, it is true for some people, but some people get really bad luck. They get stationed to a particular outpost or whatever that is that's really not like a family to them. And we know that there are systemic problems within the military. Those are things like abuse. Those are things like trauma. And so at the point where someone basically is kind of coerced into going into the military on the threat of prison, and they already have like extensive personal problems, they have, a problematic past, and then they get stationed in a place where there's really systemic problems and they face like a lot of really unfair circumstances, that's probably like a pretty big issue, I think. And ultimately it shouldn't just be like bad luck if that happens to someone. Really, I think that in this debate, it has to be realized that there's other ways that we can give prisoners better outcomes and that we can rehabilitate them, that we can give them a sense of family. And there's also other ways that we can proactively fight crime in terms of like better social systems and things like that. And so it's necessary that society and prisons feel the need to provide those opportunities rather than just kind of relegate it to the domain of the military. Because as I mentioned before, and it kind of wasn't super responded to, if the prisons can now go, well, if you need rehabilitation, if you need a sense of family, go off to the military, then that really doesn't incentivize them particularly much to reform those prisons in a positive way, in order to make them safer for prisoners, in order to make them better at rehabilitating and reintegrating prisoners into society. And by the same token, that doesn't give governments and it doesn't give societies enough of an incentive to go, actually, we need to do better. We can't just kind of like isolate criminals at the edge of society. We have to try and integrate them. And so I feel like ultimately the kind of social message that occurs when you do this is you send criminals off to the military, you stop them from being a social and political problem. And that really limits the kind of positive legal reform that you can have in areas like society, in areas like prisons. But I also just think that it's like probably somewhat unfair on those prisoners to provide them with this choice where the army is kind of presented, or the military is presented as a really good option, but potentially can hold some pretty serious issues for them that they might not necessarily realize.
Understand that currently you can't go into the military, and that's any branch, if you have a criminal record. You can't. And you still wouldn't be able to, without a waiver. Right now, you can get a waiver, but it's very, very seldom granted. They don't want you in, particularly if you're a criminal. And it's a complicated process getting this waiver. So I don't think you would have, if this option were reactivated, where prisoners would be able to enlist in the army instead of serving time, you would only have a very small percentage who would actually be able to do so. And, as far as de-incentivizing prison reform, while I agree that, wholeheartedly agree that, the prison complex definitely needs to be reformed. It's needed to be reformed for 100 years. And there's no sign, especially with our current government, to de-incentivize, that it's going to be de-incentivized. In fact, we finally made some progress in the United States with marijuana laws, and Jeff Sessions, and I'm just, he's a complete asswipe, is trying to turn that back around. 52% of every person who's arrested for a drug offense in the United States is arrested for marijuana possession. And it totally, I'm going to use profanity here, it totally fucks their life over. You go to prison for recreationally using a drug that most of the states are starting to decide you have the right, to do, but Jeff Sessions wants to reverse that. So, really, I don't think that there's any particular danger in de-incentivizing, because there's not any even slight signs that, more prisons are becoming privatized money factories for corrupt people than the reverse. And back to you.
Sure. Just kind of go through a couple of the main issues in the sort of latter half of this debate. I would first just talk about the sort of benefits that this is going to be getting. So you said in your last speech that there'd be a relatively small percentage of people who are like actually taking up this offer, because in the status quo we've got the really limited waiver that's rarely granted. I would say firstly that the status quo where you've got a limited waiver is probably quite effective, because you've got a lot of judicial discretion and so forth, which means that people who really probably shouldn't get that waiver don't get it, and people who really definitely deserve it, and for whom it would be really useful, do get it. And that's probably like a relatively effective system. But more than that, I think that loosening that system probably would mean that you'd have lots of people taking up the offer, because as you mentioned previously, the army looks attractive in terms of the kind of income that you get, in terms of like paid accommodation, food, and so forth. And so I thought it was probably pretty unlikely that there were a small percentage of people who would take up this kind of program if it was offered more broadly. But if that was true, then the kind of benefits you offered would be more limited. But then secondly, I thought that if there were lots of people who were taking, if this could get lots of people into the military, then it would be likely that the exact kind of things that you talked about as being really bad, the really like overly strong marijuana laws, or like the kind of things that entrench people in criminality for being poor or for being, a person of color or so forth, those kind of really problematic laws would actually probably be strengthened, because at the point where the military realized that actually this is a really good way of gaining people power, then they'd be incentivized essentially to strengthen a tough on crime approach in order to kind of fuel the military. Beyond that, I also thought that, sure, the sort of military complex is really terrible, and there's no immediate signs of it instantly improving, but that's a reason not to make it any worse. It's a reason not to make it easier for them just to kind of relegate problems over to the army rather than actually reforming positively. And ultimately, seeing as it's so bad, we probably don't want to give them any more reasons to be bad, and we probably want to give them as much reason as possible to need that reform, rather than just send their problems out elsewhere. Then I just quickly bring back the kind of material that I gave you about people with really problematic backgrounds going, basically having the luck of the draw, and maybe they'd have a second family, but also they'd be risking some really problematic trauma and things like that, and that's probably not the fairest thing to do with prisoners who don't have that much of a choice. Yeah, so those are the kind of main things I noticed in the debate so far. Yeah.
Okay, if I'm reading this correctly, my total time remaining is 30 seconds approximately. So I don't really have time to respond to much. I just would like to point out that currently in the U.S. military, you don't even have to be a U.S. citizen to join. You do have to be a U.S. citizen if it requires a secret security clearance, but not otherwise. And I would rather see my own countrymen given the opportunity to serve than
Okay, so just to sum up, I guess, at the end of this debate, there are a couple of things that I said sort of about the sort of broader social implications of this that weren't really responded to that much. Those were about the analysis that I gave you about prison reform and how we probably didn't want to give them any more excuses to be bad than they already have. But more than that, also the stuff about social reform in terms of like making harder, tough on crime laws in order to fuel the amount of people who are going into the army. And then secondly, I just bring back the stuff I told you about kind of people who would be going into this who aren't necessarily the best decision makers, aren't necessarily particularly educated, and aren't necessarily going to be great for the army. Ultimately, these people are being put in a really problematic situation, and I can't see how that would be the most effective for the military. Thanks.